What would you do if you saw your wife's text inviting her ex over while you were sitting in your own driveway? I gave them 1 hour to pack. Then I spent 30 days making sure everyone knew the truth. My name is Nathan Cross, and I'm a night shift mechanic who specializes in dashcam installation and vehicle diagnostics at a 24-hour service center just off the interstate. Most people don't think much about mechanics beyond oil changes and brake pads, but what they don't realize is that we see everything. Every scratch on a fender that wasn't there yesterday, every suspicious mileage discrepancy, every receipt left in a glove box that tells a story the owner would rather keep hidden. I spent 6 years in military logistics before this, learning how to track supply chains and identify patterns in chaos, and those skills translated surprisingly well to civilian life, especially when it came to reading the small details that most people overlook. My wife Claire never understood why I preferred working nights, why I liked the quiet hum of the garage at 3 a.m. when the world was asleep and I could focus on the mechanical problems in front of me without distraction, but I always told her it was about the pay differential and the lack of traffic during my commute, which was true enough even if it wasn't the whole truth. Claire worked as a project manager at a mid-sized consulting firm downtown, the kind of place where everyone wore business casual and talked about synergy and stakeholder engagement in meetings that could have been emails, and she was good at her job in the way that people who care deeply about perception and status tend to be good at jobs that reward those qualities. We had been married for 4 years, together for 6, and for most of that time I thought we were solid, the kind of couple that didn't need constant validation or dramatic gestures because we had built something steady and reliable, or at least that's what I told myself whenever I noticed the small distances growing between us. The way she stopped asking about my day, the way she started scheduling more evening work events that I wasn't invited to, the way she looked at her phone with a small smile that never quite reached her eyes when she thought I wasn't watching. On the night everything changed, I had clocked out early from my shift because we had finished a major fleet service job ahead of schedule, and my supervisor told me to take the extra hours as comp time, so I drove home around 9 in the evening instead of my usual 6 in the morning arrival. The house was a small 2-story colonial in a quiet subdivision where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least they thought they did. And as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed that the living room lights were on, even though Claire had texted me earlier saying she would be working late at the office on a project deadline. I sat in my truck for a moment, engine idling, and pulled out my phone to check if she had sent any updates I might have missed, and that's when I saw the notification preview on the lock screen of our shared tablet that synced with her messages. A text from a contact labeled simply as D that read, "He's working late again, come over." I took a screenshot of that notification without thinking, muscle memory from years of documenting evidence chains in the military, and then I sat there in the darkness of my truck cab staring at those 6 words that had just rewritten my entire understanding of my marriage. The timestamp showed the message had been sent at 8:53, just 7 minutes ago, which meant whoever D was, he was probably already inside my house or on his way, and the phrase "again" suggested this was not the first time, not even close, that my wife had invited someone over while I was supposedly at work. I turned off the engine and stepped out of the truck, closing the door quietly, and walked up the front path with my keys in my hand and my heart hammering in my chest, but my face completely calm because one thing the military teaches you is that panic is a choice and control is a discipline. And I had spent too many years learning that discipline to abandon it now, even when my world was collapsing. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, and the first thing I heard was laughter coming from the living room. Claire's bright social laugh that she used at work functions and dinner parties, followed by a man's deeper chuckle that I didn't recognize. I walked down the hallway and turned the corner into the living room, and there they were. Claire sitting on our couch with her shoes off and her legs tucked under her, and a man I had never seen before sitting in my armchair with a glass of wine in his hand, both of them freezing mid-conversation when they saw me standing in the doorway. The man was tall and clean-cut, with the kind of expensive haircut and tailored shirt that screamed corporate climber, probably in his mid-30s. And the way he looked at Claire before looking at me told me everything I needed to know about what had been happening in my house while I was at work. Claire's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, fear, calculation, and finally a forced smile as she stood up and said my name like a question, like she wasn't sure if I was really there or if I was some kind of hallucination that might disappear if she blinked hard enough. The man stood up too, setting his wine glass down on the coffee table without a coaster, which irritated me in a distant way that had nothing to do with furniture and everything to do with the casual disrespect of someone who felt comfortable enough in my home to ignore the small courtesies. He opened his mouth to say something, probably some excuse about being a coworker or a friend from college or whatever story they had prepared for an emergency like this, but I held up my hand and he stopped talking, and I looked at Claire and said in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly cold, "Pack, you have 1 hour." Claire's forced smile disappeared, and she started to say something about how this wasn't what it looked like, how she could explain everything, how I was overreacting, but I turned away from her and walked into the kitchen, pulling out my phone as I went. I had my divorce attorney's number saved in my contacts from when I had helped a buddy from my Army unit navigate his own separation 2 years ago, and I called it even though it was after business hours. And when the voicemail picked up, I left a message saying that I needed to retain him immediately for a separation filing and that I would pay whatever retainer was necessary to get the paperwork started first thing in the morning. Then I called his emergency line, which he had given me during that conversation with my buddy when he said that family law sometimes required immediate action, and he picked up on the third ring, his voice alert despite the late hour, and I explained the situation in 3 sentences. Came home early, found my wife with another man, need separation papers filed tomorrow. He asked me if I was sure, if I wanted to take some time to think about it, if there was any chance of reconciliation, and I told him no to all 3 questions. And then he asked me if I had any evidence of infidelity, and I told him I had a screenshot of a text message and 2 witnesses currently in my living room. And he was quiet for a moment before he said that he would draft the initial paperwork tonight and have it ready for my signature in the morning, and that I should document everything I could without breaking any laws or doing anything that could be used against me later. I thanked him and hung up, and then I stood in my kitchen listening to the urgent, whispered conversation happening in my living room, Claire's voice rising in pitch as she tried to convince the man to leave, his voice lower and defensive as he apparently argued about something, and then I heard the front door open and close and footsteps coming toward the kitchen. Claire appeared in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes red but not yet crying, and she asked me if we could talk about this like adults, if I could please just listen to her side of the story before I made any decisions I would regret. I looked at her and realized that I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me, or maybe I had never really known her at all, and I told her that she had 53 minutes left to pack whatever she wanted to take with her, and that I would be staying at a motel tonight so she could have the house to gather her things, but that tomorrow we would be communicating only through attorneys. She started to cry then, real tears this time, and she said that I was being cruel, that I was throwing away 4 years of marriage without even giving her a chance to explain, and I told her that she had thrown away our marriage the first time she invited someone into our home while I was at work, and that the only thing I was doing now was refusing to pretend otherwise. I walked past her and went upstairs to our bedroom, and I pulled a duffel bag out of the closet and started packing clothes and toiletries, moving methodically through the room while Claire stood in the doorway watching me with tears streaming down her face. She kept trying to talk to me, kept saying that it wasn't what I thought, that she had made a mistake, but it didn't mean anything, that we could go to counseling and work through this, but I didn't respond to any of it because I had learned a long time ago that some conversations are traps designed to make you doubt your own perception of reality, and I wasn't going to fall into that trap. When I had packed enough for a few days, I zipped up the duffel and walked back downstairs, and Claire followed me, her voice getting more desperate as she realized I was actually leaving, and she grabbed my arm as I reached for the front door and begged me to please just stay and talk to her, to not leave like this, to give her one more chance. I stopped and looked at her hand on my arm, and then I looked at her face, and I said that I had seen the text message, the one that said, "He's working late again, come over." And I watched her face go pale as she realized that I knew this wasn't a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness, but a pattern, a routine, something that had been happening regularly enough that the word again was casual and expected. She let go of my arm and stepped back, and I told her that she could stay in the house tonight, but that I wanted her out by the end of the week, and that my attorney would be in touch about the separation agreement and asset division. Then I walked out the front door, threw my duffel bag in the truck, and drove to a motel on the other side of town, where I checked in under my name and paid for a week in advance with cash, and sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial detergent and stared at the wall while my phone buzzed with increasingly frantic text messages from Claire that I didn't read. The motel room was exactly what you would expect from a place that charged by the week and didn't ask questions. A double bed with a thin comforter that had been washed so many times the pattern was barely visible, a television bolted to a particle board dresser, a bathroom with a shower stall that had seen better decades, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where my truck sat under a flickering streetlight. I didn't sleep that first night, just lay on top of the covers fully clothed and stared at the water-stained ceiling tiles while my mind replayed the scene in my living room over and over, looking for details I might have missed, clues I should have seen earlier, patterns that would explain how I had been so completely blind to what was happening in my own home. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and pulled out my laptop, opening the shared cloud account that Claire and I used for photos and documents, and I started scrolling through the metadata of recently deleted images, because one thing most people don't realize is that when you delete a photo from a shared album, The image disappears, but the metadata often remains in the backup logs, showing timestamps and GPS coordinates and device information that can tell you exactly when and where a photo was taken, even if you can't see the photo itself anymore. What I found in those metadata logs was a pattern that made my stomach turn. Dozens of deleted photos taken over the past 3 months, all from Claire's phone, all with GPS coordinates that matched an address I didn't recognize in a neighborhood about 20 minutes from our house. I copied those coordinates into a mapping application and pulled up the street view and saw a modern condo complex with a security gate and visitor parking, the kind of place where young professionals lived when they wanted to signal that they were successful but not yet ready to commit to a mortgage and a lawnmower. I took screenshots of the metadata logs, noting the dates and times, and then I cross-referenced them with our shared calendar where Claire had marked various evening commitments, team dinners, client meetings, project work sessions, and I found that every single metadata timestamp corresponded to a night when Claire had told me she would be working late or attending a work function that I wasn't invited to. The most recent cluster of deleted photos had been taken just 5 days ago, on a Wednesday evening when Claire had texted me saying she had a team dinner that would probably run until 10 or 11, and the metadata showed that her phone had been at that condo address from 7:42 in the evening until 11:18 at night, which was almost 4 hours and far longer than any legitimate work dinner would last. I felt something cold and analytical settle over me as I documented each piece of evidence. The same mindset I had used in the military when tracking supply discrepancies or investigating equipment losses, and I realized that this was going to be a long-term project. Not a single confrontation, but a systematic dismantling of whatever lies Claire had built around her affair, because the word "again" in that text message meant this had been going on for a while, and there would be more evidence to find if I knew where to look. I spent the rest of that night creating a timeline in a spreadsheet, listing every date from the metadata logs in one column, every corresponding calendar entry in another column, and every text message or communication from Claire in a third column, and what emerged was a clear pattern of deception that had been running for at least 3 months and possibly longer. On Thursday morning, I drove to my bank and requested printed statements for our joint checking account going back 6 months, telling the teller that I needed them for tax preparation purposes, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. The teller, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, printed out the statements without question and handed them to me in a manila envelope, and I sat in my truck in the bank parking lot and went through them line by line, highlighting anything that seemed unusual or unexplained. What I found made the pattern even clearer. A series of cash withdrawals over the past 3 months, each one for $200 or $300, each one taken from an ATM near Claire's office on days when she had claimed to be working late or attending evening events. The withdrawals were always labeled in our budgeting app as miscellaneous expenses or cash for errands, which had seemed reasonable enough at the time because Claire often picked up supplies for the house or paid for small things that were easier to handle with cash. But now I saw them for what they really were. A way to move money out of our joint account without leaving a clear paper trail of where it was going or what it was being used for. I photographed each page of the bank statements with my phone, making sure the date and account number were visible in each image, and then I added notes to my timeline spreadsheet indicating which withdrawals corresponded to which metadata timestamps and which calendar entries. And the picture that emerged was of someone who had been planning and executing a sustained deception with careful attention to detail. The largest withdrawal had been for $800, taken out in 2 separate transactions on the same day about 6 weeks ago. And when I cross-referenced that date with my own calendar, I realized it had been the weekend of my father's funeral, when I had driven 6 hours to my hometown to help my mother with the arrangements and attend the service. Claire had stayed behind, claiming that she had a critical project deadline that she couldn't miss and that she would pay her respects to my father in her own way, and I had been too grief-stricken and exhausted to question it or to push back against her decision to prioritize work over family. Now I understood that she had used my father's death as an opportunity to spend an entire weekend with whoever this man was, and that the $800 had probably paid for a hotel room or a weekend trip or some other romantic gesture that she had funded with our joint money while I was burying my father and comforting my mother. I sat in that truck for a long time, staring at those bank statements, and I felt something shift inside me from hurt and betrayal to cold, focused anger. The kind of anger that doesn't make you yell or throw things, but instead makes you very quiet and very patient and very determined to ensure that every single piece of evidence is documented and preserved and ready to be used when the time comes. I drove from the bank to my mechanic shop, even though it was my day off, and I let myself into the garage with my key card and went to the storage room where we kept the dashcam footage. Archives for customer vehicles. Our shop offered dashcam installation and monitoring as a premium service. and part of that service included cloud backup of footage for customers who wanted an extra layer of security. But what most people didn't know was that we also kept local backup copies on our server for 30 days in case the cloud service failed or a customer needed to retrieve footage that had been accidentally deleted. I pulled up the footage from my own truck, which I had installed a dashcam in about a year ago, mostly as a way to test the equipment and familiarize myself with the software before recommending it to customers, and I started scrolling through the archived recordings from the past 3 months. The dashcam was positioned to record the view through the windshield while I was driving, but it also had a parking mode that activated when the vehicle was stationary and detected motion in front of the camera, which meant it had been recording every time I parked in my driveway and every time someone walked past my truck or drove past my house. I found what I was looking for in the footage from 2 weeks ago, on a Tuesday evening when I had parked in the driveway before heading into work for my night shift. The camera had captured Claire's car pulling out of the garage at 7:38 in the evening, and then it had captured her car returning at 11:42 that same night. And in between those two timestamps, I could see the house sitting dark and empty because Claire had told me she was working late at the office, but the office was in the opposite direction from where her car had gone when she left. I saved that footage clip, and then I kept scrolling, finding more instances of the same pattern. Claire's car leaving in the evening and returning late at night on days when she had claimed to be at work or at work events, and each time I found one of these clips, I saved it with a timestamp and a note about what Claire had told me she was doing that night. By the time I finished going through the archives, I had 7 separate video clips showing Claire's car leaving and returning at times that contradicted her stated schedule. And when I cross-referenced those clips with the metadata logs and the bank statements and the calendar entries, every single piece of evidence lined up to show a consistent pattern of deception that had been running for months. I exported all of the footage to an external hard drive, labeled it with the date and my initials, and locked it in my personal locker at the shop, and then I drove back to the motel and added the new evidence to my timeline spreadsheet, which was now running to 3 pages and showed a clear, undeniable pattern of sustained infidelity. That afternoon, my attorney called and told me that he had drafted the initial separation paperwork, and that I could come by his office to review and sign it whenever I was ready, and I told him I would be there within the hour. His office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place where family lawyers and small accounting firms rented space because it was cheaper than the glass towers where the corporate attorneys worked. And when I arrived, he was waiting for me in a conference room with a stack of documents and a yellow legal pad covered in handwritten notes. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many marriages fall apart, and he shook my hand and gestured for me to sit down. And then he walked me through the separation agreement page by page, explaining what each section meant and what rights I was asserting and what obligations I was accepting. The agreement was straightforward: immediate separation of assets, division of joint accounts. Claire would have 30 days to remove her belongings from the house, and we would proceed with an uncontested divorce after the mandatory waiting period required by state law. I asked him about the evidence I had gathered, the screenshots and the bank statements and the dash cam footage, and he told me that while it was good to have documentation, infidelity wasn't technically relevant to the legal process of divorce in our state because we had no-fault divorce laws, but that it could become relevant if Claire tried to contest the separation or claim that she deserved a larger share of the assets, or if she tried to make any accusations against me that would require me to defend my character. He asked me if I thought Claire would fight the separation or try to make things difficult, and I told him that I honestly didn't know, that the woman I had found in my living room 2 nights ago was someone I didn't recognize and whose next moves I couldn't predict. He nodded and made a note on his legal pad, and then he asked me if there was anything else I needed to tell him, anything that might become relevant later, and I hesitated for a moment before telling him about the text message I had seen, the one that said, "He's working late again, come over," and about how that suggested this was not a one-time affair but an ongoing relationship. He asked me if I knew who the man was, and I told him I didn't, that I had never seen him before that night, and that Claire hadn't introduced him or explained who he was before I told them both to leave. He made another note, and then he looked at me over his glasses and said that I should be prepared for the possibility that this man might become a factor in the divorce proceedings, especially if he and Claire continued their relationship openly, and that I should continue documenting everything I could without crossing any legal lines or doing anything that could be construed as harassment or stalking. I signed the separation papers that afternoon, and my attorney filed them electronically with the county clerk's office before I even left his building, and he told me that Claire would be served with the papers within 48 hours by a professional process server who would document the date and time of service in case we needed proof later that she had been properly notified of the legal proceedings. He also advised me to open a new bank account in my name only and to transfer half of the funds from our joint account into it, which was my legal right under the separation agreement, and to cancel any joint credit cards or lines of credit that Claire might have access to. not out of spite, but simply to protect myself from any financial decisions she might make in anger or desperation once she realized that I was serious about ending the marriage. I thanked him and left his office, and I spent the rest of that afternoon sitting in my truck in a grocery store parking lot, making phone calls to banks and credit card companies and explaining over and over that I needed to separate my accounts from my spouse due to an impending divorce. And each time I said those words out loud, they felt more real and more final. By the time I finished with the financial logistics, it was early evening, and I realized that I hadn't eaten anything all day and that I should probably force myself to consume something even though I had no appetite. So I went into the grocery store and bought a pre-made sandwich and a bottle of water and sat in my truck eating mechanically while I thought about what my next steps should be. The evidence I had gathered so far was solid. The text message screenshot, the metadata logs, the bank statements, the dashcam footage, but it was all circumstantial in the sense that it showed a pattern of deception without definitively proving what Claire had been doing during those unexplained absences. And I knew from my military experience that circumstantial evidence could be explained away or dismissed if the person being accused was clever enough or had a good enough lawyer. What I needed was something more concrete, something that would make it impossible for Claire to claim that she had been working late or attending legitimate work functions, and as I sat there thinking about how to get that kind of evidence, I realized that the man I had seen in my living room was the key to everything. I didn't know his name or where he worked or how he knew Claire, but I knew that he had been comfortable enough in my house to sit in my chair and drink wine from my glasses, which suggested that this wasn't the first time he had been there, and I knew that Claire had texted him using a contact labeled simply as D, which meant his first name probably started with that letter. I pulled out my phone and opened Claire's social media profiles, which I had access to because we had shared our passwords years ago in one of those gestures of trust that seemed romantic at the time but now felt naive, and I started scrolling through her friends list and her tagged photos and her comment history, looking for any man whose name started with D and who appeared frequently enough in her online life to suggest a close relationship. It took me about 20 minutes of searching, but eventually I found him, Derek Ashford, listed as a senior analyst at the same consulting firm where Claire worked, with a profile photo that showed the same tall, clean-cut man I had seen in my living room, and a relationship status that said divorced, with no other details. I clicked through to Derek's profile and spent the next hour reading through his posts and photos and comments, building a picture of who he was and what his life looked like, and what I found was exactly what I had expected. A recently divorced professional in his mid-30s who posted frequently about work achievements and weekend activities and seemed to be trying very hard to project an image of someone who was thriving after his marriage ended. His most recent posts included photos from a hiking trip, a restaurant opening, and a charity fundraiser that his company had sponsored, and in the comments on that fundraiser post I saw Claire's name appear multiple times, making jokes and using the kind of casual familiarity that suggested they interacted regularly both online and in person. I took screenshots of Derek's profile and several of his posts, and then I did a reverse image search on his profile photo and found that he had a LinkedIn account as well, which listed his full employment history and confirmed that he had been working at Claire's firm for the past 4 months after transferring from their satellite office in another city. 4 months was almost exactly how long the pattern of deception had been running according to my timeline spreadsheet, which meant that Derek had probably started the affair with Claire shortly after he arrived at her office, and the fact that he was recently divorced suggested that he might be someone who had a pattern of pursuing relationships with married coworkers or who didn't respect professional boundaries. I made a note to look into whether Derek's previous divorce had involved any allegations of infidelity, because if it had, that would establish a pattern of behavior that would be useful to know about. And then I realized that the best source of information about Derek's divorce would be his ex-wife, assuming I could find her and assuming she would be willing to talk to me. I went back to Derek's social media profile and scrolled through his older posts from before his divorce, looking for any photos or mentions of his ex-wife, and I found several posts from about 2 years ago that tagged a woman named Amanda Ashford, with photos of the two of them at various events and vacations looking like a happy couple before whatever had happened to end their marriage. I clicked through to Amanda's profile and saw that she had changed her last name back to her maiden name, which was listed as Amanda Pierce, and that her relationship status now said single, and her profile photo showed her alone rather than with Derek, which suggested that the divorce had been finalized and that she had moved on with her life, at least in terms of her public presentation. Her profile was more private than Derek's, with most of her posts visible only to friends, but I could see enough from her public information to learn that she worked as a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital about 30 minutes from where I lived, and that she had a daughter who appeared to be around 7 or 8 years old based on the few public photos that showed the two of them together. I sat in my truck staring at Amanda's profile photo and trying to decide whether it would be appropriate or ethical to contact her and tell her that her ex-husband was now having an affair with my wife, and whether she would even care given that they were already divorced. But then I realized that if Derek had cheated on Amanda during their marriage, she might be willing to share information about his patterns of behavior that would help me understand what I was dealing with. I decided to wait until I had more information before reaching out to Amanda because I didn't want to involve her in my situation unless it was absolutely necessary. And instead, I focused on gathering more evidence about Derek and Claire's relationship at work. I knew that most companies had policies about workplace relationships, especially relationships between employees at different levels of seniority, and I wondered whether Derek and Claire had disclosed their relationship to their HR department or whether they were keeping it secret, which would be a violation of company policy if their firm had mandatory disclosure requirements. I pulled up the consulting firm's website and navigated to their careers page, where they had posted their employee handbook and code of conduct as part of their recruitment materials, and I downloaded the PDF and searched for keywords like relationship and disclosure and conflict of interest, and what I found was exactly what I'd hoped for. A clear policy stating that any romantic or sexual relationship between employees must be disclosed to HR within 30 days of the relationship beginning, and that failure to disclose such a relationship could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. I took a screenshot of that policy page and added it to my evidence folder, and then I started thinking about how I could use this information to apply pressure to Derek and Claire without directly confronting them or doing anything that could be construed as harassment. The answer came to me as I was sitting there in the parking lot watching people come and go from the grocery store. I didn't need to confront them directly. I just needed to make sure that the right people at their company became aware of the relationship and the fact that it hadn't been disclosed. And the best way to do that would be through someone who had standing to file a complaint, someone who had been directly harmed by Derek's pattern of behavior. That someone was Amanda, Derek's ex-wife, and if I could convince her to file a formal complaint with Derek's HR department, alleging that he had a pattern of pursuing inappropriate relationships with coworkers, the company would be obligated to investigate, and that investigation would inevitably uncover his relationship with Claire. I spent the next day trying to figure out how to approach Amanda without seeming like a stalker or a crazy person, and eventually I decided that the best approach would be direct and honest. I would contact her through social media, explain who I was and what I had discovered, and ask if she would be willing to meet with me to discuss Derek's behavior. I sent her a message through the platform explaining that I was the husband of one of Derek's coworkers, that I had recently discovered they were having an affair, and that I was trying to gather information about whether this was part of a pattern of behavior on Derek's part, and I included my phone number and email address in case she preferred to communicate through those channels instead. I didn't expect to hear back from her quickly, if at all, because I knew that my message probably sounded insane and that she had no reason to trust me or to want to get involved in my marital problems, but to my surprise, she responded within 2 hours with a message that said simply, "Call me," followed by her phone number. I called her immediately, and when she answered, her voice was cautious but not hostile, and she asked me to tell her exactly what I had seen and what evidence I had that Derek was having an affair with my wife. I walked her through everything: the text message, the metadata logs, the bank statements, the dashcam footage, the fact that Derek had been in my house drinking wine with my wife when I came home unexpectedly, and when I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line before Amanda said, in a voice that was tight with controlled anger, that this was exactly the same pattern of behavior that had destroyed her marriage to Derek 2 years ago. She told me that Derek had cheated on her with a coworker at his previous office, that she had discovered the affair when she found hotel receipts and suspicious text messages on his phone, and that when she confronted him, he had initially denied everything and then, when the evidence became overwhelming, had blamed her for not being supportive enough of his career and for not understanding the pressures he was under at work. Amanda said that she had tried to save the marriage by suggesting counseling, but Derek had refused and had instead filed for divorce, and that during the divorce proceedings he had tried to paint her as an unstable and jealous wife who was making false accusations to hurt him professionally, and it was only because she had solid evidence of the affair that she had been able to get a fair settlement and primary custody of their daughter. She told me that after the divorce was finalized, she had heard through mutual friends that Derek had continued his relationship with the coworker he had cheated with, but that relationship had apparently ended when he transferred to the new office where Claire worked, and now it seemed clear that he had simply found a new target for the same pattern of behavior. I asked Amanda if she would be willing to file a complaint with Derek's current employer about his pattern of pursuing inappropriate relationships with coworkers, and she was quiet for a moment before she said that she would need to think about it, because she didn't want to do anything that would give Derek an excuse to try to modify their custody arrangement, or to claim that she was harassing him. I understood her hesitation, and I told her that I didn't want to pressure her into doing anything she wasn't comfortable with, but that I thought it was important for Derek's employer to know about his history, especially if there were other women at the company who might become his targets in the future. Amanda told me that she would think about filing the complaint and get back to me within a few days, and in the meantime, she suggested that we meet in person to compare notes and evidence, because she said that if we were going to take action against Derek and Claire, we needed to make sure that our stories were consistent and that we had documentation for everything we claimed. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop that was roughly halfway between where we both lived, a neutral location where neither of us would feel uncomfortable or exposed, and 2 days later I found myself sitting at a corner table waiting for a woman I had never met but who had become an unexpected ally in what was rapidly turning into something much larger than just a simple divorce. Amanda arrived exactly on time, and I recognized her immediately from her profile photos. She was in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing scrubs that suggested she had come directly from her shift at the hospital, and she had the kind of tired, wary expression that I had seen on the faces of other people who had been through difficult divorces and learned not to trust easily. She sat down across from me, and we spent a few minutes on awkward small talk, both of us trying to figure out how to navigate this strange situation where we were brought together by the bad behavior of people we had once loved. And then she pulled out her phone and said that she wanted to show me the evidence she had kept from her own divorce, the text messages and receipts and photos that had proven Derek's infidelity, and that she had saved in a cloud storage folder in case she ever needed them again. What she showed me was remarkably similar to what I had found in my own investigation. Text messages between Derek and his former coworker that used the same casual, familiar tone that I had seen in the message Claire sent him, hotel receipts from weekends when Derek had claimed to be at work conferences but had actually been with his mistress, and credit card statements showing charges at restaurants and stores that Derek had initially claimed were business expenses, but that Amanda had been able to prove were personal purchases for his affair partner. The most damning piece of evidence Amanda had was a series of text messages where Derek and his coworker had discussed how to coordinate their alibis and cover stories, including specific instructions about what to tell their respective spouses about where they were and what they were doing. And reading those messages, I felt a cold recognition because the level of planning and coordination they showed was exactly what I suspected Claire and Derek were doing now. Amanda told me that during her divorce, Derek's attorney had tried to argue that the affair was a symptom of problems in their marriage rather than a cause, and that Derek had only sought comfort elsewhere because Amanda had been emotionally distant and unsupportive, but the judge had seen through that argument and had ruled that Derek's infidelity was a clear breach of the marriage contract regardless of whatever other issues might have existed. She said that the thing that had hurt her most wasn't even the affair itself, but the elaborate deception that had surrounded it. The way Derek had looked her in the eye every day and lied about where he was going and what he was doing, and the way he had made her feel crazy for questioning him when her instincts told her something was wrong. I told Amanda about the text message I had intercepted, about the word again that suggested this had been going on for a while, and about how I had spent the past week documenting every piece of evidence I could find to build a timeline of Claire's deception. I showed her my spreadsheet with the dates and times and locations, and I showed her the dashcam footage and the bank statements and the metadata logs, and as she reviewed everything, her expression shifted from sympathy to something harder and more determined, and she said that what we had between the two of us was more than enough to prove that Derek and Claire had been conducting a sustained affair and that they had been coordinating their lies to cover it up. She asked me what I wanted to do with this information, whether I was planning to use it in my divorce proceedings or whether I had some other goal in mind, and I told her honestly that I wasn't sure yet, that part of me just wanted to finalize the divorce as quickly and quietly as possible and move on with my life. But another part of me felt like Derek and Claire shouldn't be allowed to simply walk away from this without facing any consequences for their actions. Amanda nodded and said that she understood that feeling, that after her own divorce, she had struggled with the same question of whether to let it go or to make sure that Derek faced professional consequences for his behavior, and ultimately she had decided to let it go because she was exhausted from the divorce process and just wanted to focus on rebuilding her life and taking care of her daughter. But she said that she had always regretted that decision because a few months after her divorce was finalized, she had heard through mutual friends that Derek had started another relationship with a different coworker at his office, and she had realized that by not reporting his pattern of behavior to his employer, she had essentially enabled him to continue doing the same thing to other women. She told me that if she had it to do over again, she would have filed a formal complaint with his company's HR department, not out of revenge, but simply to create a paper trail that would make it harder for Derek to claim that his affair with Claire was an isolated incident rather than part of a pattern. I asked Amanda if she would be willing to file that complaint now, even though her divorce from Derek had been finalized 2 years ago, and she thought about it for a long moment before she said that she would, but only if I was willing to file a complaint as well, because she didn't want to be the only one making accusations, and she thought that having two separate complaints from two different people would make it much harder for Derek's employer to dismiss the allegations as the vindictive actions of a bitter ex-spouse. I agreed immediately, because I had already been thinking about how to use the company's workplace relationship policy against Derek and Claire, and having Amanda's corroboration and her evidence from Derek's previous affair would make the complaint much stronger and much harder to ignore. We spent the next hour drafting our complaints together, using Amanda's laptop to type up formal statements that outlined Derek's pattern of pursuing inappropriate relationships with married coworkers, that included specific dates and evidence from both his affair with Amanda's marriage and his current affair with Claire, and that cited the company's own policies about mandatory disclosure of workplace relationships and conflicts of interest. Amanda had kept copies of the emails and text messages from Derek's previous affair, and she was able to provide the name of the coworker he had been involved with and the approximate dates when that affair had taken place, which gave our complaint the kind of specific, verifiable details that would force the company to take it seriously rather than dismissing it as vague allegations. We also included in our complaint the fact that Derek had transferred to his current office shortly after his previous affair had ended, which suggested that the transfer might have been part of an effort to avoid professional consequences for his behavior at his old office. And we noted that his current affair with Claire appeared to follow the same pattern of deception and coordination that had characterized his previous affair. When we finished drafting the complaints, Amanda printed out 2 copies of each document, and we both signed and dated them. And then she said that she would submit her complaint to the company's HR department the next day through their online ethics reporting system, and that I should submit mine a few hours later so that it would appear that we had filed independently rather than coordinating our complaints. Before we left the coffee shop, Amanda asked me how I was holding up emotionally, whether I had friends or family I could talk to about what I was going through, and I told her honestly that I had been keeping most of this to myself because I didn't want to involve other people in my personal problems and because I wasn't sure how to explain the situation without sounding bitter or vindictive. She nodded and said that she had felt the same way during her own divorce, that there was a strange isolation that came with discovering that your spouse had been lying to you for months, because you couldn't talk about it without feeling like you were betraying confidences or airing dirty laundry. And yet keeping it all inside made you feel like you were going crazy because you had no one to validate your perception of reality. She gave me her phone number and told me to call her any time I needed to talk or if I discovered any new evidence that might be relevant to our complaints. And I thanked her and told her that I was grateful to have found someone who understood what I was going through, even though I wished we had met under different circumstances. I drove back to my motel room that evening feeling something that was almost like hope, or at least like purpose, because for the first time since I had seen that text message on my phone, I felt like I was taking concrete action rather than just passively documenting evidence and waiting for something to happen. I knew that filing the HR complaints would set off a chain of events that I couldn't control, that Derek and Claire would be interviewed and investigated and possibly disciplined or terminated depending on what the investigation found, and that there was a risk that this could all blow back on me if Derek or Claire decided to claim that I was harassing them or making false accusations. But I also knew that I had solid evidence to back up everything I was claiming, that Amanda's corroboration would make it much harder for them to dismiss our complaints as the actions of jealous or vindictive ex-spouses, and that the company's own policies gave us a legitimate basis for demanding that they take action against employees who had violated those policies. The next morning, I woke up early and checked my phone to see if Amanda had sent me any updates, and I found a text message from her saying that she had submitted her complaint through the company's online ethics portal at 8 o'clock that morning, and that she had received an automated confirmation email saying that her complaint had been received and assigned a case number, and that someone from the HR department would be in touch within 5 business days to discuss next steps. I waited until noon to submit my own complaint, using the same online portal and filling out the same forms that Amanda had used, and I attached digital copies of all my evidence, the screenshots of the text message and the metadata logs, the photos of the bank statements and the dashcam footage, the timeline spreadsheet that showed the pattern of deception over 3 months. When I clicked the submit button, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety, because I knew that I had just set something in motion that couldn't be undone, and that within a few days, Derek and Claire would both be called into meetings with HR representatives and asked to explain their relationship and why they hadn't disclosed it according to company policy. I spent the rest of that day trying to distract myself with work, going into the mechanic shop even though it was supposed to be my day off, and volunteering to help with some of the more complex diagnostic jobs that the other mechanics didn't want to deal with, and my supervisor was happy to have the extra help and didn't ask any questions about why I was suddenly spending so much time at work instead of at home. That evening, I got a call from my attorney asking if I had heard anything from Claire or her attorney about the separation papers, and I told him that I hadn't heard anything directly, but that I assumed she had been served by now since it had been more than 48 hours since we filed. He told me that according to the process server's report, Claire had been served at her office 2 days ago and had signed the acknowledgement of service, which meant that she was now officially on notice of the separation proceedings and had 30 days to respond if she wanted to contest any of the terms. My attorney also mentioned that he had received a call from an attorney representing Claire, asking about the possibility of negotiating the terms of the separation agreement rather than having Claire file a formal response, which suggested that Claire was taking the divorce seriously and was being advised by someone who understood that fighting the separation would be expensive and probably futile given the evidence I had already gathered. I told my attorney that I was willing to negotiate on minor issues like the division of household items and the timeline for Claire to move out of the house, but that I was not willing to compromise on the basic terms of the separation, which were that I would keep the house and my retirement accounts, and she would keep her own retirement accounts and her car, and that we would split the balance of our joint accounts 50-50 after accounting for the cash withdrawals she had made over the past few months. My attorney said that those terms were reasonable and that he would communicate them to Claire's attorney and that he expected we would be able to reach an agreement without having to go through a lengthy court process, which would save both of us money and stress in the long run. 3 days after Amanda and I filed our HR complaints, I received an email from the company's ethics hotline system informing me that my complaint had been reviewed by the compliance department and had been forwarded to the HR department for investigation, and that I should expect to be contacted within the next week by an HR representative who would want to interview me and review my evidence in more detail. The email also included a case number and a reminder that the company took all ethics complaints seriously, and that retaliation against anyone who filed a complaint in good faith was strictly prohibited and would result in immediate termination, which I took as a good sign that they were treating this as a legitimate concern rather than as a nuisance complaint from a disgruntled spouse. I forwarded the email to Amanda, who replied that she had received a similar message and that she had already been contacted by an HR representative to schedule an interview for later that week, and she said that the representative had sounded professional and had asked detailed questions about the timeline of Derek's previous affair, and whether she had any documentation to support her allegations. I waited another 2 days before I received my own call from the HR department, and the woman who contacted me introduced herself as Patricia Vance, the Director of Employee Relations, and she explained that she was leading the investigation into the complaints that had been filed about Derek Ashford and that she wanted to set up a time to meet with me to discuss my allegations and review my evidence. I told her that I was available to meet whenever was convenient for her, and we scheduled an appointment for the following afternoon at a coffee shop near my mechanic shop, because Patricia said that she preferred to conduct these interviews in neutral locations rather than at the company office where other employees might see us and start asking questions. When I met with Patricia the next day, she turned out to be a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of some of the senior officers I had worked with in the military, and she came prepared with a legal pad and a laptop and a list of very specific questions about my relationship with Claire and my evidence of her affair with Derek. I walked Patricia through everything I had documented, showing her the screenshots and the metadata logs and the bank statements and the dashcam footage, and I explained how I had discovered the affair and how I had spent the past few weeks systematically gathering evidence to establish the pattern of deception. Patricia took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about dates and times and locations, and she seemed particularly interested in the text message I had intercepted that said, "He's working late again, come over," because she said that the word "again" suggested a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident, and patterns of behavior were exactly what the company needed to establish in order to take disciplinary action against employees who violated workplace relationship policies. She also asked me whether I had any evidence that Derek and Claire's relationship had affected their work performance or had created conflicts of interest in terms of project assignments or performance reviews, and I told her that I didn't have direct evidence of that because I didn't work at the company and didn't have access to their internal systems, but that I thought it was worth investigating whether Claire had received any preferential treatment or advancement opportunities since Derek had arrived at the office 4 months ago. Patricia made a note of that and said that the company would be conducting its own internal review of project assignments and performance evaluations to see if there were any irregularities that might suggest favoritism or conflicts of interest. And she told me that based on what I had shown her, there was clearly sufficient evidence to proceed with a formal investigation into whether Derek and Claire had violated the company's mandatory disclosure policy for workplace relationships. She explained that the investigation would involve interviewing both Derek and Claire separately, reviewing their work communications and calendars for any evidence of the relationship, and potentially interviewing other employees who might have witnessed interactions between them that suggested they were more than just professional colleagues. Patricia also told me that if the investigation confirmed that Derek and Claire had been in an undisclosed relationship, the company would have to decide what disciplinary action to take, and that action could range from a formal written warning to suspension or termination, depending on the severity of the policy violation and whether there were any aggravating factors like conflicts of interest or misuse of company resources. I asked Patricia how long the investigation was likely to take, and she said that in her experience, these cases usually took between 2 and 4 weeks to complete, depending on how cooperative the subjects were and whether they contested the allegations or admitted to the relationship right away. She also warned me that I should expect Derek and Claire to deny the relationship initially, because that was the standard response from employees who were caught violating workplace policies, and that they might try to claim that my evidence was fabricated or taken out of context, or that I was making false allegations out of spite or jealousy. I told Patricia that I had anticipated that response, and that was why I had been so careful to document everything with timestamps and metadata and multiple sources of corroboration. And she nodded approvingly and said that the thoroughness of my evidence would make it very difficult for Derek and Claire to successfully deny the relationship, especially once Amanda's evidence from Derek's previous affair was factored into the investigation. After my meeting with Patricia, I went back to my motel room and sent Amanda a text message updating her on how my interview had gone and letting her know that the HR investigation was officially moving forward. Amanda replied that her own interview had gone well and that Patricia had told her the same thing about the timeline and the process, and that she felt confident that the company was taking the complaints seriously rather than trying to sweep them under the rug to avoid negative publicity. Amanda also mentioned that she had been doing some additional research into Derek's employment history, and that she had discovered through LinkedIn that he had worked at 2 other companies before joining his current firm, and that at both of those previous companies he had only stayed for about 18 months before moving on, which suggested a pattern of short tenures that might be worth investigating to see if he had been forced to leave those positions due to similar workplace misconduct. I thought that was an interesting observation, and I forwarded it to Patricia with a note suggesting that she might want to contact Derek's previous employers to see if there were any documented concerns about his professional conduct or relationships with coworkers, and Patricia responded that the company's standard background check process didn't typically include that kind of detailed investigation, but that given the seriousness of the current allegations, she would make some informal inquiries to see what she could learn. Over the next week, I tried to focus on my work and on finalizing the details of my separation agreement with Claire, but it was difficult to concentrate on anything else because I kept thinking about what was happening at Derek and Claire's office and wondering when they would be called in for their interviews and how they would react when they realized that their affair had been exposed and that they were facing potential professional consequences. My attorney called me about 10 days after the HR interviews to tell me that Claire's attorney had reached out again with a revised proposal for the separation agreement, and that the new proposal included some concessions that suggested Claire was becoming more realistic about her position and was trying to avoid a prolonged legal battle. The main change in the revised proposal was that Claire was now willing to accept the 50-50 split of joint assets that I had proposed originally, without demanding any additional compensation for the household items she would be leaving behind, or for the inconvenience of having to find a new place to live on short notice, and her attorney had also indicated that Claire would be moving out of the house within the next 2 weeks, rather than waiting for the full 30-day period that the original agreement had allowed. My attorney said that this sudden willingness to cooperate and to expedite the separation process suggested that something had changed in Claire's circumstances, and he speculated that she might be facing pressure at work, or that she might be worried about additional evidence coming to light that would make her look worse in the divorce proceedings. I told my attorney about the HR investigation and about the complaints that Amanda and I had filed, and he was quiet for a moment before he said that the timing made sense, and that Claire had probably been notified by her employer that she was under investigation and was now trying to finalize the divorce quickly before the investigation concluded, and potentially led to her termination or other professional consequences that would affect her earning capacity and her ability to negotiate a fair settlement. He said that from a strategic perspective, I should probably accept Claire's revised proposal and move forward with finalizing the separation, because the longer we dragged things out, the more opportunities Claire would have to try to complicate the proceedings, or to make allegations against me in an attempt to shift blame or to create leverage. I agreed with his assessment and told him to communicate our acceptance of the revised proposal to Claire's attorney, and within 2 days we had a signed separation agreement that both parties had approved, and that was ready to be filed with the court as soon as the mandatory waiting period was completed. Around this same time, I received another email from Patricia Vance informing me that the HR investigation had progressed to the point where she had conducted preliminary interviews with both Derek and Claire, and that while she couldn't share specific details about what they had said during those interviews, she could tell me that both of them had acknowledged that they had been in a relationship but had claimed that it was a recent development that had begun after Derek's transfer to the office, and that they had been planning to file the required disclosure paperwork with HR but hadn't gotten around to it yet because they were still figuring out whether the relationship was serious enough to warrant formal disclosure. Patricia said that this response was not uncommon in these types of cases, because employees who were caught violating disclosure policies often tried to minimize the duration and seriousness of the relationship in order to make the policy violation seem less egregious, but she said that my evidence and Amanda's evidence clearly contradicted their claims and showed that the relationship had been ongoing for at least 3 months and possibly longer. Patricia also told me that, as part of the investigation, she had reviewed Derek and Claire's work email accounts and calendars with the company's IT department, and that they had found numerous instances of personal communications between Derek and Claire during work hours, including email exchanges that used coded language and inside jokes that suggested a level of familiarity and intimacy that went beyond normal professional colleagueship. Patricia explained that the email review had also uncovered several instances where Derek and Claire had coordinated their schedules to attend the same off-site meetings and conferences, and that in at least 2 cases they had booked hotel rooms at the same location on the same dates, even though their official work assignments didn't require them to travel together or to stay overnight at those particular venues. She said that this pattern of coordinated travel was particularly concerning from a policy perspective because it suggested that Derek and Claire had been using company resources and work-related travel as cover for their personal relationship, which was not only a violation of the disclosure policy but also potentially a misuse of company funds if they had claimed reimbursement for expenses that were personal rather than business-related. Patricia told me that the company's finance department was now conducting a separate audit of Derek and Claire's expense reports to determine whether there had been any inappropriate charges or reimbursements, and that if they found evidence of financial misconduct, that would be grounds for immediate termination, regardless of what the HR investigation concluded about the relationship itself. I asked Patricia what the likely timeline was for completing the investigation and making a decision about disciplinary action, and she said that the company was trying to move quickly because cases like this tended to become more complicated the longer they dragged on, especially if other employees became aware of the investigation and started taking sides or spreading rumors that could damage workplace morale. She said that she expected to have a final report ready within the next week, and that once the report was completed, it would be reviewed by the company's legal department and senior management team, who would make the final decision about what actions to take against Derek and Claire. Patricia also warned me that I should be prepared for the possibility that Derek or Claire might try to contact me directly once they realized that I had filed a complaint and provided evidence to the investigation, and she advised me not to respond to any such contacts and to forward any messages or communications I received to her so that they could be documented as part of the investigation record. As it turned out, Patricia's warning came just in time, because 2 days later I received a text message from Claire asking if we could meet to talk about what was happening at her office and whether I had been involved in filing any complaints against her or Derek. The message was carefully worded to sound casual and non-confrontational, but I could sense the desperation underneath the casual tone, and I knew that Claire was fishing for information about what I knew and what I had told the investigators. I forwarded the message to Patricia without responding to Claire, and Patricia replied that I should continue to ignore any direct communications from Claire, and that she would make a note in the investigation file that Claire had attempted to contact me, which could be interpreted as an attempt to intimidate or influence a witness in an ongoing investigation. I felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that Claire's attempt to manipulate me was now going to be used as additional evidence of poor judgment and potential policy violations, and I made sure to save screenshots of all the messages she sent me over the next few days as she became increasingly frantic in her attempts to get me to respond. During this same period, Amanda contacted me to let me know that she had been interviewed a second time by Patricia Vance, and that during this follow-up interview Patricia had asked her much more detailed questions about Derek's behavior during their marriage, and whether there had been any warning signs or patterns that Amanda had noticed before she discovered his affair. Amanda said that she had told Patricia about how Derek had become increasingly secretive about his phone and his computer during the months leading up to her discovery of the affair, and how he had started working longer hours and traveling more frequently for work, even though his job responsibilities hadn't actually changed in any significant way. She had also told Patricia about how Derek had become defensive and accusatory whenever Amanda questioned him about his schedule or his whereabouts, and how he had tried to make Amanda feel like she was being paranoid and controlling when her instincts were telling her that something was wrong, which was a classic gaslighting technique that many people use when they are trying to cover up infidelity. Amanda mentioned that Patricia had seemed very interested in these behavioral patterns because they matched what other employees at Derek's current office had reported observing in terms of his interactions with Claire, including the fact that several coworkers had noticed Derek and Claire leaving work events together or having private conversations in conference rooms with the door closed, which had raised some eyebrows but hadn't been formally reported because most people assumed it was just a close working relationship rather than anything inappropriate. Patricia had apparently interviewed several of these coworkers as part of the investigation, and their observations had provided additional corroboration for the timeline that Amanda and I had established through our evidence, which made it increasingly difficult for Derek and Claire to maintain their claim that the relationship was recent and had only begun after Derek's transfer to the office. About a week after my last conversation with Patricia, I received a phone call from my attorney informing me that he had just gotten off the phone with Claire's attorney, and that Claire's attorney had indicated that Claire was now willing to sign off on the final divorce papers immediately rather than waiting for the standard waiting period to expire, and that she was also willing to waive her right to any spousal support or future claims against my assets in exchange for a quick and clean resolution of the divorce. My attorney said that this was highly unusual and suggested that Claire was facing some kind of imminent crisis that was making her desperate to finalize the divorce as quickly as possible, and he asked me if I knew what might be driving this sudden urgency on Claire's part. I told him about the HR investigation and about the possibility that Claire might be facing termination or other professional consequences, and my attorney nodded and said that would certainly explain why Claire was suddenly so eager to settle everything quickly, because if she lost her job or had her professional reputation damaged, it would be much harder for her to argue that she deserved any ongoing financial support from me. My attorney advised me to accept Claire's offer and to move forward with finalizing the divorce immediately, because the terms she was proposing were actually more favorable to me than what I had originally requested, and because there was always a risk that if we delayed, Claire might change her mind or her circumstances might change in a way that would make her less willing to accept such generous terms. I agreed with his recommendation and told him to proceed with filing the final divorce papers, and within 3 days we had a signed decree that officially ended my marriage to Claire, and that gave me everything I had asked for in terms of asset division and future financial independence. The whole process from the night I discovered the affair to the finalization of the divorce had taken less than 6 weeks, which my attorney said was remarkably fast for a divorce case, but which felt like an eternity to me because every day of that 6 weeks had been filled with stress and anger, and the constant mental effort of documenting evidence and managing the various legal and professional processes that I had set in motion. The day after my divorce was finalized, I received an email from Patricia Vance informing me that the HR investigation had been completed and that the company had made its final decision regarding disciplinary action against Derek and Claire. Patricia's email was formal and carefully worded, but the key information was clear. Derek had been terminated from his position effective immediately for violating the company's workplace relationship disclosure policy, for misusing company resources to facilitate a personal relationship, and for providing false and misleading information during the investigation. Claire had been given a written warning and placed on a performance improvement plan, which was essentially a probationary status that meant she would be closely monitored for the next 6 months and that any further policy violations or performance issues would result in her immediate termination. Patricia explained that the different levels of discipline reflected the fact that Derek, as the more senior employee, had greater responsibility for knowing and following company policies, and that his history of similar conduct at previous employers had been taken into account when determining the appropriate disciplinary action. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions when I read Patricia's email: satisfaction that Derek had faced real consequences for his actions, relief that the investigation had concluded and that I could start moving forward with my life, but also a strange emptiness because now that the immediate crisis was over, I had to figure out what came next and what kind of life I was going to build for myself as a newly divorced man in his mid-30s. Amanda sent me a text message congratulating me on the outcome of the investigation and thanking me for being willing to come forward with my evidence, because she said that without my corroboration and my detailed documentation, the company might not have taken her complaints seriously or might have dismissed them as the grievances of a bitter ex-wife. She also mentioned that she had heard through mutual friends that Derek was already talking attorneys about suing the company for wrongful termination, which didn't surprise either of us because Derek seemed like the type of person who would never accept responsibility for his own actions and would always try to blame someone else when things went wrong. Over the next few weeks, I focused on practical matters like selling the house that Claire and I had shared and finding a new apartment where I could start fresh, without all the memories and associations of my failed marriage, and I threw myself into my work at the mechanic shop with a kind of manic energy that my coworkers noticed but were polite enough not to comment on directly. I knew that I was using work as a way to avoid thinking too much about what had happened and about how I felt about it all, but I also knew that sometimes avoidance is a necessary coping mechanism and that I would have time later to process all the emotions and to figure out what lessons I had learned from this experience. My supervisor at the mechanic shop pulled me aside one afternoon and asked if everything was okay, and when I told him that I had just gone through a difficult divorce, he nodded sympathetically and said that he had been through 2 divorces himself, and that the most important thing was to give myself time to heal and not to rush into any major decisions about relationships or life changes until I had some distance and perspective on what had happened. I appreciated his advice, and I tried to follow it, but I also found that I couldn't completely turn off the analytical part of my mind that kept reviewing the evidence and the timeline and trying to understand how I had missed the signs of Claire's affair for so long, and whether there had been warning signals that I had overlooked or dismissed because I wanted to believe that my marriage was solid. I thought about all the nights when Claire had come home late with explanations about work deadlines and client meetings, and how I had accepted those explanations without question because I trusted her and because I was often working nights myself and wasn't home to verify where she had actually been. I thought about the way she had become more distant and less affectionate over the past few months, and how I had attributed that to work stress and to the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship rather than considering the possibility that she might be getting her emotional and physical needs met elsewhere. Looking back on it all with the clarity that comes from having concrete evidence and a complete timeline, I could see that there had been dozens of small signs that something was wrong, but that none of those signs by themselves had been dramatic enough to trigger alarm bells or to make me seriously question whether Claire was being faithful. I realized that this was one of the insidious things about infidelity. It rarely announced itself with obvious, unmistakable evidence, but instead revealed itself through an accumulation of small inconsistencies and subtle changes in behavior that were easy to rationalize or explain away when you were looking at them individually rather than as part of a larger pattern. The text message I had intercepted that night in my driveway had been the catalyst that forced me to start looking at all those small signs as pieces of a puzzle rather than as isolated incidents, and once I had started assembling those pieces, the picture that emerged had been undeniable and devastating. I wondered sometimes whether I would have been better off never seeing that text message, never knowing about the affair, just continuing to live in ignorant contentment while Claire carried on her relationship with Derek behind my back, but I always came back to the conclusion that living a lie was worse than facing a painful truth, and that I would rather deal with the hurt and anger of betrayal than spend the rest of my life being deceived by someone I had trusted completely. About 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I ran into Amanda at a grocery store near where I had moved into my new apartment, and we ended up having coffee together and catching up on what had been happening in our lives since the HR investigation had concluded. Amanda told me that Derek had indeed filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the company, claiming that the investigation had been biased and that the company had violated his rights by terminating him without giving him adequate opportunity to defend himself, but that her attorney had told her the lawsuit was unlikely to succeed because the company had documented everything carefully and had followed all the proper procedures for conducting workplace investigations. She also mentioned that Derek had been having trouble finding new employment because potential employers were doing background checks and discovering the circumstances of his termination, and that he had apparently been forced to move back in with his parents because he couldn't afford to maintain his condo on unemployment benefits alone, which Amanda admitted gave her a certain amount of satisfaction, even though she tried not to take pleasure in other people's misfortunes. I told Amanda about how I had sold the house and moved into a smaller apartment, and how I was trying to rebuild my life and figure out what I wanted to do next now that I was no longer tied to Claire or to the life we had built together. Amanda nodded and said that she remembered that feeling from her own divorce, the strange mixture of freedom and disorientation that came from suddenly having to make all your own decisions without consulting a partner or considering someone else's preferences and needs. She said that it had taken her almost a year after her divorce to feel like she had really found her footing again and established a new routine and a new sense of identity that wasn't defined by her relationship to Derek, and she encouraged me to be patient with myself and to recognize that healing from betrayal was a process that couldn't be rushed or forced. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, and I found that it was easier to talk to Amanda about what I was going through than it was to talk to my friends or family members who hadn't experienced the specific kind of betrayal that comes from discovering a spouse's infidelity, because Amanda understood in a way that other people couldn't the particular pain of realizing that someone you loved had been systematically lying to you for months. As we were getting ready to leave the coffee shop, Amanda mentioned that she had heard through mutual acquaintances that Claire was still working at the consulting firm, but that she had been passed over for a promotion that she had been expecting to receive, and that several of her colleagues had distanced themselves from her after learning about the affair and the HR investigation. Amanda said that she didn't know whether this was because Claire's professional reputation had been damaged by the investigation, or because people at the office had simply decided that they didn't want to be associated with someone who had violated company policies and had been placed on a performance improvement plan. But either way, it seemed clear that Claire was facing social and professional consequences that would probably affect her career trajectory for years to come. I felt a complicated mixture of emotions when I heard this. Part of me felt vindicated that Claire was experiencing some of the same isolation and judgment that I had felt when I first discovered the affair. But another part of me just felt sad that our marriage had ended in such a destructive way, and that both of our lives had been so thoroughly disrupted by choices that Claire had made. Around this same time, I started seeing a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from relationship trauma and betrayal, because I had realized that even though the practical aspects of the divorce were settled and the HR investigation was complete, I was still carrying a lot of anger and hurt that I hadn't fully processed or dealt with in any meaningful way. My therapist, whose name was Dr. Ellen Reyes, was a woman in her 50s, who had a calm, non-judgmental manner that made it easier for me to talk about things that I'd been keeping bottled up for months, and she helped me understand that my response to discovering Claire's affair, the systematic documentation of evidence, the filing of HR complaints, the careful coordination with Amanda, had been a way of asserting control in a situation where I had felt completely powerless and betrayed. Dr. Reyes explained that this kind of response was actually quite common among people who had military or law enforcement backgrounds, because those professions trained you to respond to crises by gathering information and following procedures rather than by reacting emotionally, and that while this approach had been effective in terms of protecting my legal and financial interests, it had also allowed me to avoid dealing with the emotional impact of the betrayal until after all the practical matters were resolved. Over the course of several therapy sessions, Dr. Reyes helped me work through the anger I felt toward Claire and toward Derek, and she helped me understand that while it was natural and appropriate to feel angry about being betrayed, holding on to that anger indefinitely would only hurt me and would prevent me from moving forward with my life. She also helped me recognize that part of what had made the betrayal so painful was not just the fact that Claire had been unfaithful, but the fact that she had been willing to lie to me repeatedly and to construct an elaborate web of deception in order to maintain her affair, which had violated not just our marriage vows, but also the basic trust and honesty that I had thought were the foundation of our relationship. Dr. Reyes pointed out that this kind of systematic deception was actually more damaging in many ways than a one-time mistake or a moment of weakness, because it showed a sustained willingness to prioritize personal desires over the well-being of a partner and over the integrity of the relationship, and that recognizing this distinction was important for understanding why I felt so betrayed and why it was so difficult for me to imagine ever forgiving Claire for what she had done. One of the things that Dr. Reyes encouraged me to do was to write a letter to Claire expressing everything I felt about the affair and the divorce, with the understanding that I would never actually send the letter, but would use it as a way of organizing my thoughts and getting closure on the relationship. I spent several evenings working on this letter, and what emerged was a document that was part angry accusation, part sad reflection on what our marriage had been and what it might have become if Claire had made different choices, and part acknowledgement that I bore some responsibility for the distance that had grown between us, even if I didn't bear responsibility for her decision to respond to that distance by having an affair rather than by talking to me about what was wrong. Writing the letter was more difficult and more emotionally draining than I had expected, because it forced me to confront feelings that I had been avoiding or suppressing, but it was also strangely cathartic because it gave me a way to articulate things that I had been thinking about but hadn't been able to put into words. In the letter, I told Claire that what hurt most wasn't even the affair itself, but the realization that she had been willing to look me in the eye every day and lie about where she had been and what she had been doing, and that she had been planning to use a fake abuse narrative against me if I ever discovered the truth and tried to hold her accountable. I wrote about how the discovery of that draft document that her sister had found had been almost more devastating than the discovery of the affair, because it showed that Claire had been thinking strategically about how to destroy my reputation and my credibility if our marriage ended, and that she had been willing to make false accusations of abuse in order to protect herself from the consequences of her own choices. I also wrote about how I had spent weeks after discovering the affair questioning my own judgment and wondering how I could have been so blind to what was happening, and how I had come to understand that Claire's deception had been sophisticated enough that most people in my position would have missed the signs or would have rationalized them away just as I had done. Toward the end of the letter, I wrote about how I hoped that Claire would eventually take responsibility for what she had done, and would recognize that her actions had consequences not just for me, but also for herself and for Derek, and for everyone else whose lives had been affected by the affair and its aftermath. I wrote that I didn't expect her to apologize or to try to make amends, because I didn't think there was anything she could say or do that would undo the damage that had been done, but that I hoped she would at least be honest with herself about the choices she had made and about the kind of person those choices revealed her to be. When I finished writing the letter, I read it through several times, and then I put it in a folder with all the other evidence and documentation I had gathered during the divorce process, and I filed that folder away in a box in my closet where I wouldn't have to look at it regularly, but where I could access it if I ever needed to remind myself of why the marriage had ended and why I had made the choices I had made in response to Claire's betrayal. As the months passed, and I settled into my new life as a divorced man living alone in a small apartment and working night shifts at the mechanic shop, I found that the acute pain of the betrayal gradually faded into something more manageable, a dull ache that was always present in the background, but that didn't dominate my thoughts or my emotions the way it had in the immediate aftermath of discovering the affair. I started reconnecting with friends I had neglected during my marriage, and I started pursuing hobbies and interests that I had put aside because Claire hadn't been interested in them, or because they hadn't fit into the life we had built together. I took up hiking and started spending my days off exploring trails in the mountains near where I lived, and I found that the physical exertion and the solitude of being out in nature helped clear my mind and gave me perspective on everything that had happened. I also started volunteering at a veterans organization that helped former military personnel transition to civilian life, and I found that using my own experiences to help other people navigate difficult life changes gave me a sense of purpose that I had been missing since the divorce. Amanda and I stayed in touch and met for coffee every few weeks to catch up on our lives and to provide mutual support as we both worked through the aftermath of our respective betrayals. And over time, our relationship evolved from being primarily focused on our shared experience of being betrayed by Derek into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. Amanda told me during one of our coffee meetings that she had started dating again, cautiously and with a lot of anxiety about whether she could trust someone new after what Derek had done to her, but that she was trying to remain open to the possibility of finding a healthy relationship even though part of her was terrified of being hurt again. I told her that I admired her courage in putting herself out there again, because I wasn't sure I was ready to even think about dating or relationships, and that I was still working through my own trust issues and trying to figure out what I wanted from life now that I was no longer defined by my marriage to Claire. Amanda said that she understood completely and that there was no timeline or schedule for when someone should be ready to move on after a betrayal, and that the most important thing was to be honest with myself about where I was emotionally and not to rush into anything just because I felt like I should be over it by now, or because other people expected me to have moved on. One afternoon, about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I was working on a particularly complicated engine diagnostic at the mechanic shop when my supervisor came over and told me that there was someone in the waiting area asking to speak with me. And when I went out to see who it was, I was surprised to find Claire's sister Jenna standing there looking uncomfortable and nervous. I hadn't spoken to Jenna since shortly after the divorce, when she had called me to apologize for not realizing sooner what Claire had been doing and to tell me that she supported my decision to end the marriage, and seeing her now brought back a flood of memories and emotions that I had been trying to keep at bay. Jenna asked if we could talk somewhere private, and I led her to a small office at the back of the shop where we sometimes met with customers to discuss repair estimates, and once we were alone, she told me that she had come to give me some information that she thought I deserved to know, even though Claire would be furious if she found out that Jenna had told me. Jenna explained that Claire had been struggling significantly since the divorce and the HR investigation, both professionally and personally, and that she had been seeing a therapist who was helping her work through the consequences of her actions and trying to understand why she had made the choices she had made. Jenna said that Claire had recently told her family that she took full responsibility for the affair and for the lies she had told, and that she recognized that her decision to draft that fake abuse narrative had been particularly cruel and manipulative, and that she deeply regretted the pain she had caused me and the damage she had done to our marriage. Jenna was careful to emphasize that Claire wasn't asking for forgiveness or trying to reopen communication with me, but that she had wanted Jenna to let me know that she understood the gravity of what she had done and that she was trying to become a better person and to make sure she never hurt anyone that way again. I listened to all of this with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity, because part of me wondered whether this was just another manipulation or whether Claire was genuinely experiencing remorse and trying to change, but I also recognized that it didn't really matter either way because my relationship with Claire was over, and nothing she did or said now could change what had happened or repair the trust that had been broken. I thanked Jenna for coming to tell me this, and I told her that I appreciated her honesty and her willingness to maintain a relationship with me even though it probably made things complicated with her sister, and Jenna said that she had struggled with the decision about whether to stay in touch with me or to cut ties completely in order to support Claire, but that ultimately she had decided that she valued our friendship and that she didn't think supporting Claire meant she had to pretend that what Claire had done was acceptable or that I had been wrong to respond the way I had. Jenna also told me that Claire's relationship with Derek had ended shortly after Derek was terminated from his job, and that Claire had told her family that she realized the relationship had been a mistake, and that she had been using it as an escape from problems in our marriage rather than addressing those problems directly, which Jenna said was probably the most honest and self-aware thing Claire had said about the whole situation. I asked Jenna how Claire was doing professionally, and Jenna said that Claire was still working at the consulting firm, but that she had been passed over for several promotions, and that her relationships with her colleagues had been strained by the investigation and by the knowledge that she had violated company policies, and that Claire was considering looking for a new job where she could start fresh without the baggage of what had happened. After Jenna left, I sat in that small office for a long time, thinking about what she had told me and trying to figure out how I felt about the news that Claire was apparently experiencing genuine remorse and trying to change her behavior. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that Claire was facing ongoing consequences for her actions, and that the affair had damaged her professional reputation and her relationships with colleagues and family members. But another part of me just felt tired and sad that our marriage had ended in such a destructive way, and that both of our lives had been so thoroughly disrupted by choices that could have been avoided if Claire had been willing to be honest about her unhappiness and to work on our problems together rather than seeking comfort and validation from someone else. I realized that I had been carrying around a lot of anger toward Claire for the past 6 months, and that while some of that anger was justified and appropriate, holding on to it indefinitely was only hurting me and preventing me from fully moving forward with my life, and that maybe it was time to start letting go of the anger and focusing instead on building the kind of life I wanted to live now that I was free from the marriage and from the constant stress of dealing with Claire's deception. That evening I had a session with Dr. Reyes, and I told her about Jenna's visit and about what she had said regarding Claire's remorse and her efforts to change, and Dr. Reyes asked me how I felt about this information and whether it changed anything about how I viewed the divorce or my decision to end the marriage. I told her that it didn't change anything in terms of my conviction that ending the marriage had been the right decision, because even if Claire was genuinely remorseful now, that didn't undo the months of systematic deception or the fact that she had been willing to draft a false abuse narrative to use against me, and that I couldn't imagine ever being able to trust her again after what she had done. But I also told Dr. Reyes that hearing about Claire's remorse had made me realize that I was ready to stop being angry at her and to start focusing on my own healing and growth rather than on what Claire was or wasn't doing with her life, and that I thought this represented an important shift in my emotional state and in my ability to move forward. Dr. Reyes nodded and said that this was a significant milestone in my recovery from the betrayal, because it showed that I was beginning to separate my own well-being and happiness from Claire's actions and choices, and that I was recognizing that I had the power to decide how much energy and attention I wanted to give to the past versus how much I wanted to invest in building my future. She also pointed out that forgiveness didn't necessarily mean reconciliation or even communication with the person who had hurt you, but could simply mean releasing the anger and resentment that were keeping you tied to the past and preventing you from fully embracing new possibilities and relationships. I told Dr. Reyes that I wasn't sure I was ready to forgive Claire in any meaningful sense, but that I was ready to stop letting my anger toward her dominate my thoughts and emotions, and that I wanted to focus on figuring out what kind of life I wanted to build for myself now that I was no longer constrained by the expectations and compromises that had been part of my marriage. Over the next few months, I continued working with Dr. Reyes on processing my emotions and developing healthier patterns of thinking about relationships and trust. And I also started making more concrete plans for my future in terms of career development and personal goals. I had been working as a night shift mechanic for several years, and while I was good at the work and found it satisfying in many ways, I had always thought about eventually opening my own shop or moving into a management position where I could use my military logistics experience to help run a larger operation. I started taking some business courses at a local community college, focusing on small business management and accounting, and I began developing a business plan for potentially opening my own automotive service center that would specialize in the kind of diagnostic work and dashcam installation services that I had become known for at my current shop. My supervisor was supportive of these plans and even offered to help me make connections with suppliers and equipment vendors when I was ready to start seriously pursuing the business venture, and having this concrete goal to work toward gave me a sense of purpose and direction that I had been missing since the divorce. Amanda and I continued to meet regularly for coffee, and during one of our conversations, she mentioned that she had been thinking about the fact that both of us had been betrayed by Derek in different ways and at different times, and that there was something almost darkly funny about the fact that Derek's pattern of behavior had been so consistent that it had allowed us to compare notes and build a case against him that neither of us could have built alone. She said that, in a strange way, Derek's inability to change his behavior or to learn from his mistakes had been his downfall, because if he had been more careful or more strategic about his affairs, he might have been able to avoid the professional consequences that had ultimately cost him his job and his reputation. I agreed with her assessment and added that I thought Derek was probably the kind of person who would never really take responsibility for his actions or recognize that his behavior was the problem, and that he would probably spend the rest of his life blaming other people for the consequences of his own choices, which was both sad and pathetic, but also meant that he was unlikely to ever change or to stop hurting the people around him. Amanda told me that she had heard through mutual acquaintances that Derek's wrongful termination lawsuit had been dismissed by the court, and that Derek was now working in a completely different industry at a much lower salary than he had been making at the consulting firm, and that he was apparently still living with his parents because he couldn't afford his own place. She said that while she didn't take pleasure in Derek's misfortune, she did feel a sense of justice in knowing that his actions had real and lasting consequences, and that he couldn't simply charm his way out of the situation or convince people that he was the victim rather than the perpetrator. I told Amanda that I felt the same way about Claire, that while I didn't wish her harm or want her to suffer unnecessarily, I did think it was important that she face the consequences of her choices and that she understand that betraying someone's trust and lying systematically for months wasn't something that could be easily forgiven or forgotten. As we sat there talking about Derek and Claire and the various ways their lives had been affected by the exposure of their affair, I realized that both Amanda and I had reached a point where we could discuss these events with a certain amount of emotional distance and perspective, rather than with the raw pain and anger that had characterized our earlier conversations. I told Amanda that I thought this shift in how we talked about our experiences was a sign that we were both healing and moving forward, even though the process had been slow and difficult, and there were still moments when the anger and hurt would resurface unexpectedly. Amanda agreed and said that she had noticed the same thing in herself, that she could now go days or even weeks without thinking about Derek or the affair, whereas in the months immediately after her divorce, she had been consumed by thoughts of what he had done and how he had betrayed her trust. She said that her therapist had told her that this gradual fading of the acute emotional pain was a normal part of the healing process, and that eventually the memories of the betrayal would lose their power to hurt her and would become just another part of her life story rather than the defining event that colored everything else. Around this time, I received an unexpected phone call from Patricia Vance, the HR director who had conducted the investigation into Derek and Claire's affair, and she told me that she was calling to let me know that the company had recently settled Derek's wrongful termination lawsuit out of court, and that as part of the settlement agreement, Derek had agreed to drop all claims against the company and to sign a non-disparagement agreement that prevented him from making negative statements about the company or about the investigation process. Patricia said that she wanted me to know about this settlement because there had been some concern that Derek might try to retaliate against me or Amanda for providing evidence to the investigation, and the company's legal department wanted to make sure that we were aware of the non-disparagement agreement and that we should contact them immediately if Derek violated that agreement by attempting to contact us or by making any threatening or harassing statements. I thanked Patricia for the heads up and told her that I hadn't heard from Derek since the investigation concluded and that I hoped the settlement would mark the end of any potential complications from the whole situation. Patricia also mentioned that Claire was still employed at the company, but that she had been moved to a different department and was no longer working on any projects that involved client-facing work or significant decision-making authority, which Patricia said was a way of managing the risk that Claire might violate company policies again, while still giving her an opportunity to rehabilitate her professional reputation over time. Patricia said that the company had considered terminating Claire along with Derek, but that they had ultimately decided that the different levels of seniority and responsibility warranted different disciplinary responses, and that Claire's willingness to acknowledge the policy violation and to accept the performance improvement plan had been a factor in the decision to retain her employment. I told Patricia that I understood the company's reasoning and that I appreciated her keeping me informed about how the situation had been resolved, and after we hung up, I found myself thinking about how strange it was that Claire was still working at the same company where the affair had taken place, and wondering whether she found it difficult or uncomfortable to go to work every day, knowing that many of her colleagues were aware of what had happened and had probably formed negative opinions about her character and judgment. That weekend, I drove up to the mountains for a solo hiking trip, something I had been doing more frequently as a way of clearing my mind and getting some physical exercise and solitude, and as I was hiking along a trail that overlooked a valley filled with pine trees and granite outcroppings, I found myself thinking about the past year and about how much my life had changed since that night when I had seen Claire's text message in my driveway. I thought about how I had gone from being a married man who believed his life was stable and predictable to being a divorced man living alone and trying to figure out what he wanted from the future, and about how that transformation had been both painful and liberating in ways that I was still trying to fully understand. I realized that while I wouldn't have chosen to go through the experience of discovering Claire's affair and going through the divorce process, the experience had taught me important lessons about trust and honesty and the importance of paying attention to warning signs rather than ignoring them because they were inconvenient or uncomfortable to acknowledge. I also thought about Amanda and about how our unlikely friendship had developed out of our shared experience of being betrayed by Derek, and about how having someone who truly understood what I was going through had made the healing process easier and less isolating than it might have been otherwise. I made a mental note to tell Amanda the next time we met for coffee how much I appreciated her friendship and her willingness to share her own experiences and insights, because I knew that without her support and corroboration during the HR investigation, the outcome might have been very different, and Derek might have been able to talk his way out of the consequences of his actions. As I stood there on that mountain trail looking out over the valley, I felt a sense of peace and clarity that I hadn't experienced in a long time, and I realized that I was finally beginning to let go of the anger and hurt that had been weighing me down for the past year, and that I was ready to start thinking about what I wanted to build in my life rather than what I had lost. When I got back to my apartment that evening, I found a letter in my mailbox from Claire's attorney, and my first instinct was to feel a surge of anxiety about what new complication or demand might be contained in the letter, but when I opened it I found that it was actually a formal notification that Claire had decided to waive her right to any future claims against my assets or income, and that she was signing a final release that would prevent her from ever trying to reopen the divorce settlement or to seek additional compensation or support. The letter explained that Claire had made this decision as part of her effort to take full responsibility for the end of the marriage and to allow both of us to move forward with our lives without any lingering legal or financial entanglements, and while I was skeptical about whether this gesture was motivated by genuine remorse or by some other strategic consideration, I was also relieved to know that the divorce was truly final and that I wouldn't have to worry about Claire trying to make additional claims or demands in the future. I called my attorney to let him know about the letter and to ask whether I needed to do anything in response, and he told me that he would review the release document to make sure it was properly drafted and legally binding, but that assuming everything was in order, this would represent the absolute final resolution of my divorce from Claire and would give me complete peace of mind that there were no outstanding issues or potential future complications. My attorney also mentioned that in his experience, it was relatively unusual for someone to voluntarily waive future claims in this way, and that it suggested Claire was either receiving good legal advice about the importance of making a clean break, or that she was genuinely trying to make amends for what she had done by removing any possibility of future conflict or litigation. I told my attorney that I didn't really care what Claire's motivations were as long as the release was legally valid and would protect me from any future claims, and he assured me that he would make sure everything was properly documented and filed with the court. That night, I had dinner with a few friends from my military days who had moved to the area and who I had been reconnecting with over the past few months. And during the meal, one of them asked me how I was doing after the divorce and whether I was thinking about dating again or whether I was planning to stay single for a while. I told him honestly that I wasn't sure what I wanted in terms of relationships, that part of me was curious about the possibility of meeting someone new and building a healthier relationship based on better communication and mutual respect, but that another part of me was still gun-shy about trusting someone enough to be vulnerable with them after what Claire had done. My friend nodded and said that he had gone through a similar experience after his own divorce, and that it had taken him almost 2 years before he felt ready to seriously date again, and that there was no shame in taking whatever time I needed to heal and to figure out what I wanted before jumping into a new relationship. Another friend at the table mentioned that he had recently started using dating apps and had been surprised by how different the dating landscape was compared to when we had all been in our 20s, and he joked that trying to navigate online dating in your 30s after a divorce felt like learning a completely new language instead of social rules. We all laughed at that, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but I found myself thinking later that evening about whether I was ready to even consider dating again, and whether I had done enough work on myself and on processing the betrayal to be able to enter a new relationship without bringing all my baggage and trust issues with me. I decided that I probably needed to spend more time working with Dr. Reyes on these questions before I seriously considered putting myself out there in the dating world, because the last thing I wanted was to meet someone who might be a good match for me and then sabotage the relationship because I was still carrying unresolved anger or fear from my marriage to Claire. A few weeks later, I had a session with Dr. Reyes where we talked specifically about the question of when and how to start dating again after a betrayal. And she told me that there was no universal timeline or set of criteria that would tell me when I was ready, but that some good indicators to look for were whether I could talk about my divorce without becoming emotionally overwhelmed, whether I had developed a clear understanding of what had gone wrong in my marriage and what I would do differently in future relationships, and whether I felt genuinely curious about and open to meeting new people rather than just feeling like I should be dating because that's what people expected me to do. Dr. Reyes also emphasized that it was important to be honest with potential partners about my recent divorce and about the fact that I was still working through some trust issues, because trying to hide or minimize those realities would only create problems down the road and would prevent me from building the kind of authentic, honest relationship that I said I wanted. I told Dr. Reyes that based on those criteria, I probably wasn't quite ready to start seriously dating yet, but that I felt like I was getting closer to that point, and that I was at least open to the possibility of meeting someone new if the opportunity presented itself naturally. She said that sounded like a healthy and realistic assessment, and that I should trust my instincts about when I felt ready rather than trying to force myself to move faster than felt comfortable just because I thought I should be over the divorce by now. We also talked about the importance of learning to recognize red flags in potential partners, and Dr. Reyes helped me identify some of the warning signs that I had missed or ignored in my relationship with Claire. Things like her tendency to be secretive about her phone and her schedule, her defensiveness when I asked questions about where she had been or what she had been doing, and her pattern of making me feel like I was being unreasonable or paranoid when I expressed concerns about our relationship. Dr. Reyes pointed out that these behaviors were classic signs of deception, and that in future relationships I should pay attention to whether someone was open and transparent about their life, or whether they seemed to be hiding things or creating unnecessary barriers to communication. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, I received a call from Amanda asking if I would be willing to meet her for coffee because she had something important she wanted to discuss with me, and when we met the following weekend, she told me that she had been contacted by a journalist who was writing an article about workplace affairs and the policies that companies use to address them, and that the journalist wanted to interview both of us about our experiences with Derek's termination and the HR investigation process. Amanda said that she was initially hesitant to participate in the interview because she didn't want to relive all the painful details of Derek's betrayal or to risk having her name published in connection with the story, but that the journalist had assured her that she could remain anonymous and that the focus of the article would be on corporate policies and best practices rather than on the specific details of individual cases. I told Amanda that I would need to think about whether I was comfortable participating in an interview like that, because while I believed that companies should have strong policies against undisclosed workplace relationships, and that employees who violated those policies should face consequences, I wasn't sure I wanted to become a public spokesperson for that position, or to have my personal story used as an example in a news article. Amanda nodded and said that she had similar concerns, but that she had ultimately decided to participate in the interview because she thought it was important for people to understand that workplace affairs weren't just personal matters that only affected the individuals involved, but that they had broader implications for workplace culture and for the well-being of other employees who might be affected by favoritism or conflicts of interest created by undisclosed relationships. She said that the journalist had told her that many companies were re-evaluating their policies in light of recent high-profile cases of workplace misconduct, and that having real examples from people who had been affected by these situations could help inform better policies and enforcement mechanisms. I told Amanda that I appreciated her perspective and that I would think seriously about whether I wanted to participate, and that I would let her know my decision within the next few days after I had a chance to discuss it with Dr. Reyes and get her input on whether talking publicly about my experience might be helpful or harmful to my ongoing healing process. When I brought up the question with Dr. Reyes during our next session, she asked me what I hoped to accomplish by participating in the interview and whether I felt emotionally ready to talk about my experience with someone outside of our therapeutic relationship and outside of the small circle of friends and family who already knew what had happened. I told her that I wasn't sure what I hoped to accomplish, but that I thought there might be some value in sharing my story if it could help other people who were going through similar situations feel less alone or help companies understand the importance of enforcing their workplace relationship policies consistently and transparently. Dr. Reyes said that those were valid reasons to consider participating, but that I should also think carefully about whether I was prepared for the possibility that the article might generate public attention or comments, and whether I had the emotional resources to handle potentially negative reactions or to deal with the renewed focus on a painful chapter of my life that I had been working hard to move beyond. After thinking about it for several days and weighing the potential benefits against the potential costs, I decided to participate in the interview with the understanding that my name would be changed and that identifying details about my workplace and location would be kept vague to protect my privacy. I met with a journalist at a coffee shop, and she turned out to be a woman in her 40s who had previously written about workplace issues and employment law, and she explained that her article was focusing on the gap between corporate policies on paper and how those policies were actually enforced in practice, and on the ways that power imbalances and favoritism could undermine even well-designed policies if companies weren't vigilant about enforcement. I spent almost 2 hours talking with her about my experience with Claire's affair, about the evidence I had gathered and the HR complaint process, and about how I felt the company had handled the investigation and the disciplinary actions that had resulted from it. The journalist asked me thoughtful questions about what had motivated me to file the HR complaint rather than just focusing on my divorce, and I explained that I had felt it was important to create a paper trail and to make sure that Derek's pattern of behavior was documented so that he couldn't simply move to another company and do the same thing to other women without anyone knowing his history. I also told her about how meeting Amanda and learning about Derek's previous affair had been a turning point in my understanding of the situation, because it had shown me that what I was dealing with wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of behavior that had been enabled by Derek's ability to manipulate situations and avoid accountability. The journalist seemed particularly interested in this aspect of the story, and she asked whether I thought companies needed to do more to check employment references and to investigate patterns of behavior when evaluating candidates for positions, rather than just relying on standard background checks that might not reveal previous ethical violations or workplace misconduct. When the article was eventually published a few months later, I was surprised and gratified to see that the journalist had done a thorough and balanced job of presenting the issues, and that she had included perspectives from HR professionals and employment lawyers, as well as from people like Amanda and me who had been directly affected by workplace affairs. The article used pseudonyms for all the individuals involved and changed enough identifying details that I didn't think anyone who didn't already know my story would be able to connect it to me, and the overall tone of the piece was serious and analytical rather than sensationalistic or gossipy. Amanda sent me a text message after the article was published saying that she thought the journalist had done a good job, and that she hoped the article might lead to some companies reevaluating their policies and taking workplace relationship disclosures more seriously, and I agreed with her assessment and felt like participating in the interview had been worthwhile even though it had required me to revisit some painful memories and emotions. As I approached the 1-year anniversary of the night I had discovered Claire's affair, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in my life over the past 12 months and on how far I had come in terms of healing from the betrayal and rebuilding my sense of self and purpose. I had gone from being a married man who thought he knew what his future looked like to being a single man who was still figuring out what he wanted from life. And while that process had been difficult and painful and had required me to confront some uncomfortable truths about myself and about my marriage, I also felt like I had emerged from it as a stronger and more self-aware person who had a better understanding of what I needed from relationships and what I was no longer willing to tolerate or compromise on. I realized that the anger and hurt that had dominated my emotions in the months immediately after discovering the affair had gradually transformed into something closer to acceptance and peace, and that while I would never forget what Claire had done, or the way our marriage had ended, I was no longer defined by that experience or trapped by the need to constantly revisit it or to seek additional revenge or vindication beyond what had already been achieved through the divorce and through Derek's termination.